In just 72 hours, Jasmine Crockett turned a $500 fine for wearing a cross into an $800 million lawsuit. Judge Charles Hargrove tried to humiliate her and crush her faith. But instead, Jasmine flipped the entire system on its head. She didn't just win for herself, she ignited a nationwide movement to defend religious freedom across America. So how did one small symbol spark a battle that shook the very foundations of U.S. justice? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The marble pillars of the D.C. federal courthouse loomed under a heavy gray sky, casting long shadows across the stone steps as Jasmine Crockett passed through security. Her black leather briefcase hung at her side, the silver cross at her collarbone catching a stray beam of light, as if it had something to say. Inside, the atmosphere was taut, the low murmurs of attorneys, court officers, and reporters filling the cavernous chamber like a storm waiting to break. Jasmine moved with quiet authority, taking her place at the edge of the plaintiff's table, her tailored dark suit sharp against the solemn backdrop. She was not here to argue today. She had been dispatched as a legal observer by the White House. Nothing more. A silent witness to a case already tangled in political thorns. The banning of public prayer in a city park. From the raised bench, Judge Charles Hargrove surveyed the room with a hard gaze, his gavel resting heavily in his hand, as if itching to be used. His eyes fell on Jasmine and stayed there. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then his voice, sharp and cold, sliced through the charged air. "Miss Crockett," he barked, making heads snap up across the courtroom, "your religious display is inappropriate here." Conversations died mid-sentence. A soft intake of breath rippled through the rows of spectators. Jasmine blinked once, slowly, but said nothing. She lowered her gaze to her open folder, willing the moment to pass. It didn't. "You are ordered to remove the cross immediately," Hargrove continued, voice rising slightly. "Failure to comply will result in a fine." Then, without waiting for a response, he leaned back in his chair, voice dripping in disdain, delivering the words that would change everything. "This courtroom is a place of law, not superstition. The cross doesn't belong here. Neither do fanatics." The words landed with a thud, cold, final, punitive. Jasmine's pen froze mid-sentence. Her eyes didn't flicker. She didn't blink. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Rows of court officers shifted uncomfortably. A reporter's pencil slipped from numb fingers and clattered onto the floor. Then, slowly, deliberately, Jasmine closed her notebook. She stood, moving with a calm precision that somehow felt louder than a shout. She turned to face Hargrove directly. No anger on her face, no trembling rage. Only the quiet, immovable conviction of someone who had fought battles far rougher than this one. Her voice, when it came, was low, steady, and razor-sharp. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the First Amendment guarantees me the right to express my faith, silently, personally, without disruption." She took a breath, not because she needed it, but because it was important to show she wasn't afraid. "This cross isn't a protest. It isn't a performance. It's a promise I made to my mother, who worked 3 jobs so I could survive law school. It is part of who I am. And no, Your Honor, I will not remove it." The words fell into the courtroom like heavy stones into still water, sending invisible shock waves through every soul present. Judge Hargrove's jaw clenched, his face flushed a shade darker. Without even masking the coldness in his voice, he slammed his gavel once and pronounced, "500, effective immediately. Mark it in the record." For a split second, the world seemed to tilt. Jasmine's fingers froze on the page, but she did not look down, did not flinch. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her eyes to meet Hargrove's glare, the weight of generations of injustice burning behind her calm gaze. Around her, court officers exchanged uneasy glances. A young reporter's pen slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the tile floor. Jasmine rose, smooth and deliberate, the small cross catching the fluorescent light like a blade unsheathed. She didn't shout. She didn't protest. Instead, in a voice that cut sharper than any scream, she asked, loud enough for every soul in the courtroom to hear, "You're fining me for a piece of jewelry, But I've seen attorneys in this very courtroom wear offensive slogans on their ties and you said nothing. So I'll ask once plainly, are you enforcing the law or your own discomfort? The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Impossible to ignore, impossible to erase. Hargrove's face flushed a dangerous shade of red, but he said nothing. Across the courtroom, something shifted. An invisible thread of fear and shame pulling tight around the judge's gavel, around the marble walls, around the very foundation he thought unshakable. Jasmine remained standing, silent and unblinking, her cross gleaming under the harsh light, a quiet but devastating act of defiance. Somewhere in the gallery, a veteran in a worn blue jacket whispered to his seatmate, "That woman's not here to play games." And outside, though no one knew it yet, the winds of a new kind of battle had already begun to howl through the corridors of power. The lawsuit was ready. The strategy was in motion. But Jasmine Crockett understood better than anyone. Legal filings moved at the speed of bureaucracy. Change needed to move faster. Faster than fear, faster than control. And in this century, that meant one thing: taking the battle to the public before the system could bury it. She didn't want pity, she didn't want silence. She wanted a roar, loud enough to shake the marble off those courthouse walls. And so, sitting at the head of her conference table, Jasmine gave the order that would ignite the next phase of war. Jake Torres worked fast, his fingers flying across the keyboard like a concert pianist set on fire. Within minutes, the raw audio clip was ready. Judge Hargrove's voice, unmistakable, cutting through the courtroom's heavy air like a whip. "The cross doesn't belong here. Neither do fanatics." Jake paired it with a still frame from court security footage. Jasmine standing calm, unflinching. Silver cross glowing under the harsh, fluorescent lights. No special effects, no flashy edits. Just the brutal truth, laid bare. Above it, one hashtag pulsed on into every screen: "Judge on trial." At first it was a ripple, a few hundred views, a few dozen comments, but within the hour, it was a tsunami. Phones buzzed in coffee shops, offices, airports. Cable news tickers picked it up. Twitter exploded. TikTok reenactments appeared, some respectful, others mocking. Facebook groups formed overnight. "Stand with Jasmine." The internet split clean down the middle. One side called her a hero, a living testament to First Amendment courage in a world that had forgotten what freedom actually cost. They shared old clips of her past cases, photos of her leading voter rights marches, interviews where she spoke about growing up scraping by on food stamps while dreaming of a law degree. The other side sharpened their knives, accusing her of manufacturing outrage, of grandstanding for attention, of weaponizing faith for political gain. Hashtags like Crossgate and Crockett Chaos trended, seeded by paid political trolls and anonymous accounts. Jasmine watched it all unfold from her office, the glare of the news reports flashing across the polished surface of the conference table. Jake sat at the far end, laptop open, reading real-time engagement stats with wide eyes. 500,000 impressions, and climbing like a rocket, he muttered. His voice was half disbelief, half awe. "You're not just viral, you're a movement." Jasmine leaned back in her chair, arms folded. She wasn't smiling. Viral wasn't victory. Viral was pressure, and pressure had to be channeled, or it collapsed under its own noise. She needed to cut through the noise. She needed to make them see the core, the injustice beating beneath all the headlines and hashtags. So when Newsmax called and offered a primetime slot, she didn't hesitate. She didn't prepare talking points. She didn't run it through aides. She walked into the studio with nothing but the truth. Under the hot white lights of the Newsmax set, Jasmine sat tall, her black blazer crisp, the silver cross still hanging defiantly around her neck. The anchor introduced her with barely concealed excitement, calling her the woman at the center of America's newest cultural firestorm. Cameras zoomed in. The host asked the first question, predictable, shallow. "Miss Crockett, what do you say to those who claim you wore that cross to provoke a reaction?" Jasmine didn't rush. She didn't blink. Her voice, when it came, was low, clear, devastating. "Everyone's asking what I wore. she said, eyes locked on the camera, her tone steady as bedrock. But no one's asking why a judge felt so threatened by it that he had to punish me. She leaned forward, her fingers lightly resting on the table. I didn't wave a flag. I didn't chant. I didn't disrupt. I sat quietly and listened, just like everyone else in that room. A pause, razor sharp. The cross wasn't the problem. The problem was what it stood for, and the fact that I refused to hide it. In control rooms across the country, producers scrambled to clip the moment. In homes, in bars, in living rooms, millions of people leaned forward in their seats. Not because Jasmine shouted, but because she didn't have to. The weight of her silence, the force of her refusal to be minimized, hit harder than any slogan or campaign ad ever could. The host stumbled for the next question, thrown off balance by the sheer clarity of her answer. But it didn't matter. The message had already landed. Jasmine Crockett wasn't playing defense. She wasn't begging for understanding. She was flipping the courtroom tables and daring the system to answer for itself. And outside, far beyond the glass walls of the studio, the ground beneath Washington, D.C. had already begun to tremble. The Newsmax interview was still racking up millions of views when a new storm quietly crept into Jasmine Crockett's world. A storm much darker, much more deliberate. She had barely made it back to her office when her phone buzzed with a new email. No subject line, no name, just 3 words glowing on the screen like a warning shot fired in the dark. "You need to see this." She clicked. An attachment downloaded. Jasmine's heart beat once, heavy and slow, before she even opened the file. She didn't know yet, but her battle had just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. It wasn't about courtroom decorum anymore. It wasn't about one judge's bias. It was about something far bigger and far more dangerous. Rachel Harper, who had insisted on staying late, walked over the moment she saw Jasmine's face stiffen. Jake Torres rubbed his eyes awake from the conference room couch, stumbling over with his laptop in hand. Together, under the sterile glow of the overhead lights, they opened the file. It was a series of screen captures. Court system emails, internal only, not meant for public eyes. Each one more incriminating than the last. At the center of it all, Judge Charles Hargrove, and not just him. There it was, in black and white. An email thread directly between Hargrove and Senator Daniel Cleen, one of the loudest, most aggressive liberal voices against the current White House. Jasmine felt the weight of it before she even finished reading. The subject line was chilling: Crockett strategy. And in the body of the email, like a punch aimed at her entire existence, the words burned: target her cross. Make her the symbol of chaos. It will rattle the White House. No ambiguity, no legal cover, no misunderstanding. This wasn't about maintaining courtroom neutrality. This wasn't about protecting judicial integrity. It was a weaponized attack, engineered in private emails, planned with political precision, and executed under the false banner of judicial authority. Jasmine inhaled once, slowly, and exhaled through her nose. She didn't shout. She didn't curse. She didn't crumple the papers in her hands. She simply stood there, breathing in the full, ugly truth. Rachel's knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the table. Jake stared at the screen like he was seeing the blueprint for an assassination. Nobody spoke first. Jasmine broke the silence, her voice low, controlled, but vibrating with something deeper than anger. "They're not just coming after me," she said, her tone so steady it sent a chill through the room. "They're coming after everything I represent." And in that moment, the entire fight changed. Jasmine wasn't just a woman standing up for her rights in a hostile courtroom. She wasn't just another target of bureaucratic pettiness. She was standing at the center of a coordinated political assault, one that reached from the courtroom straight into the veins of American power. The courtroom hadn't been an accident. The fine hadn't been a mistake. It was a message. Silence her, rattle the pillars, destabilize the administration she stood beside. But they had made one fatal mistake. They thought she would crack. Jasmine turned to Rachel and Jake, her face hardening into something colder, sharper, more unstoppable than before. "We go public," she said, each word deliberate. "Not tomorrow, tonight, before they can spin it, erase it, or hide. Rachel nodded once, sharp and precise. Jake was already at his laptop, fingers flying. Every breath in the room felt like a drum beat counting down to detonation. Jasmine stood at the center, hands steady at her sides, the silver cross still gleaming against her chest like a battle flag. This wasn't personal anymore. It was war. The leaked emails were damning, yes, but Jasmine had been in the legal world long enough to know that words alone, no matter how shocking, would never be enough to crush a system that had been protecting itself for decades. There had to be more, a paper trail, a history, something hidden in the cracks, something that would prove this wasn't just one rogue judge caught in the act, but a machine quietly running beneath the surface, unchecked for years. And somewhere deep inside the courthouse, far from the cameras, someone was already pulling the curtain back. That someone was Linda Martinez, a veteran inspector for the Judicial Review Commission. Linda wasn't a woman who rushed to judgment. She had spent 2 decades investigating federal misconduct, and she knew how systems lie, not through loud denials, but through silence, red tape, and misplaced files. That morning, she walked into the secured basement records vault of the D.C. District Court with 2 staffers, a legal warrant, and a feeling she hadn't had since her first corruption case back in 2008, that something was seriously wrong. The room was cold, lit by a flickering fluorescent bulb. The air smelled of metal and mold. Row after row of locked file drawers towered in silence, holding the bones of forgotten cases and buried truths. Linda's eyes scanned every label until she found one that didn't quite belong. An old iron box on the back wall, almost hidden behind a stack of obsolete case law binders. The tag read simply, "Internal Disciplinary Restricted Access." There was no key, no code, no digital record showing it had even been accessed in the last 5 years. That was enough for her. She nodded at her deputy, who pried it open with a crowbar. The lock cracked with a groan, like something that hadn't seen light since the Bush administration. Inside was a thick manila file, worn at the edges but perfectly intact, stamped with a red diagonal stripe. "Confidential, Judge Charles Hargrove." She placed it gently on the table, snapped on gloves, and began to open it. The first few pages were case summaries. Then came printed transcripts, then scanned complaints, and then laid out in cold, factual language. The numbers. Over 250 incidents. Documented, signed, recorded across 5 years. Defendants fined, plaintiffs reprimanded, court observers warned, attorneys cautioned, bailiffs quietly instructed. And the reason? In almost every case it was the same. The presence of a religious symbol, a necklace, a pin, a bracelet, a scarf, a phrase on a t-shirt, and overwhelmingly, the names on those documents shared 2 things in common. They were people of color, and they were people of faith. A young black mother fined for wearing a silver crucifix, an elderly Latino man removed from a hearing for whispering a prayer, a Muslim woman reprimanded for adjusting her hijab in the gallery, even a 12-year-old boy cited for carrying a rosary in his hand during a custody hearing. One entry read, in chilling clinical tone, "Subject appeared in court with visible necklace shaped like cross. Reprimanded under courtroom decorum clause. Judge Hargrove." Page after page, file after file. This wasn't enforcement, it was targeting. And it was done with full knowledge that few would question it, fewer would challenge it, and almost none would have the power or resources to fight back. And then, deep in the stack, Linda found something that made her chest tighten. A handwritten note, scrawled across a memo header under Hargrove's initials. No date, no context. Just one line, written in black pen, the loops tight and pressed hard into the page. "Silence faith. It complicates order." She froze. Her eyes traced the sentence again, making sure it wasn't her mind exaggerating it. But there it was, blunt, clear, unmistakable. He hadn't just acted on bias. He had documented the philosophy behind it. Linda sat back in her chair, the file still open, the sentence staring back at her like a confession from the grave. The room around her was still, too still. Even her deputies seemed frozen by what they'd just seen. This wasn't an accidental pattern. This wasn't a string of subjective decisions. This was a deliberate doctrine, a quiet policy of suppression, wielded through authority and buried beneath legal language. And it had gone on for years. She leaned forward again, this time with absolute purpose. She pulled out her phone, activated the secure chain of custody camera system, and began snapping photos. Every page, every record, every name, every note. The file was sealed into an evidence bag. The log was filed. The chain was signed. This wasn't just proof of misconduct. It was proof of systemic persecution, carried out under the color of law. Linda zipped the bag closed, rose to her feet, and turned to her team. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't shake. It simply delivered judgment. Deliver this to Jasmine Crockett, personally. And then, softer, but carrying the full weight of years of injustice. And tell her she was never alone in that courtroom. The moment Jasmine laid eyes on the black file, she knew this wasn't just a case anymore. It was a reckoning. And if the system wanted a fight, she was about to give them one they'd never forget. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, law students, activists, and ordinary citizens who had waited hours in the cold just for a seat in the gallery. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but that didn't stop the weight of the moment from pressing against every wall. The air was electric, tense, the kind of stillness that only exists right before something historic happens. Jasmine Crockett stepped through the courtroom doors, wearing her signature navy suit in the same silver cross that had sparked the fire. But today she wore it not as a target, but as a banner. At her side, Rachel Harper carried a wheeled briefcase stuffed with evidence, and Jake Torres followed with his phone buzzing nonstop. Journalists were already camped outside, ready to explode the story the second it broke. Judge Amelia Ruiz presided. Her reputation was legendary. Hard but fair, immune to public pressure. When she called the courtroom to order, the room dropped into silence like a stone in water. Jasmine was called to the stand first. Rachel walked her there without saying a word, just a firm grip on her shoulder before she let go. Jasmine sat, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore in. The prosecution opened with the documents, emails between Judge Hargrove and Senator Daniel Clean. The jury was shown printouts on a large screen. One line appeared in bold. Target her cross, make her the symbol of chaos. It will rattle the White House. Gasps echoed in the gallery. Judge Ruiz silenced them with a glance, but didn't hide the tightening of her jaw. Next came the court clerk's notebook, 12 years of personal records noting a disturbing pattern. Disproportionate fines, warnings, removals, and private reprimands involving religious symbols, crosses, hijabs, yarmulkes. And then came the audio file. The courtroom listened as Judge Hargrove's voice played over the speakers. The cross doesn't belong in this courtroom. Neither do fanatics. The room stiffened. A juror's hand twitched toward his mouth. Even Judge Ruiz blinked slowly, as if absorbing the full rot beneath the bench she presided over. And then it was Jasmine's turn. She adjusted the microphone. The room fell even quieter. Her voice, when it came, wasn't loud, but it carried. They tried to make my faith a weapon against me, she began, eyes moving deliberately across the jury box. But they forgot. Truth doesn't kneel. The words didn't just hang in the air. They struck, and they stayed. When I walked into that courtroom, I didn't yell. I didn't chant. I didn't even speak. I wore a cross, quietly, and for that I was fined, humiliated, labeled a fanatic. Not because I disrupted anything, but because my silence said more than they were ready to hear. The jury watched her, frozen. She didn't look away. That fine wasn't about court decorum. It was about control. It was about reminding people like me, black, female, faithful, that we're only allowed to exist in certain shapes. But I wasn't raised to shrink. I was raised to stand. A woman in the gallery dabbed her eyes. A veteran in the front row nodded slowly, fists clenched in his lap. This isn't just about me, Jasmine said. It's about the dozens, no, hundreds, of people whose names you saw in that file. People who walked into the same courthouse with hope and walked out punished for what they wore, what they believed, or who they were. Rachel placed the black file on the table next to her. The jury glanced at it like it was radioactive. The law is supposed to be blind, but Judge Hargrove didn't act blind. He acted like a man aiming a weapon, one that he built out of silence and made legal by habit. She paused, breathing slow and deep. They thought the cross would break me. But they don't understand. It's what held me together. Judge Ruiz finally spoke. Thank you, Ms. Crockett. But the room wasn't ready to exhale just yet. Then came the twist no one expected. The defense called Judge Charles Hargrove to the stand. He looked thinner, older, like a man who hadn't slept in days. His hands shook slightly as he swore in. He wouldn't meet Jasmine's eyes. Rachel, standing before him with all the calm of a surgeon, asked the question straight. Did you knowingly conspire with Senator Daniel Clean to target Ms. Crockett in your courtroom? Hargrove's throat bobbed. He looked at the jury, then at Judge Ruiz, then down at his hands. Yes, he whispered. Gasps broke out. Ruiz didn't silence them this time. Rachel continued. Why? Because they told me it would help, he muttered. They said, if we embarrassed her, if we made her look extreme, it would damage her credibility, hurt the administration, make her go away. He looked up finally, eyes red, voice trembling. I was told to humiliate her, in public, and I agreed. No one spoke. One juror, an older man with salt and pepper hair and a faded Marine's pin on his lapel, wiped his eyes. Another, a retired school teacher, sat back, visibly shaken. Rachel closed the folder. No further questions. And in that instant, the case was no longer in doubt. The facts had spoken, the motive had confessed, the damage had been named, and the person responsible had finally admitted it under oath. But it wasn't Jasmine's victory that made the room hold its breath. It was the truth, because it had stood up and it hadn't knelt. The courtroom's walls could barely contain the aftershocks of Hargrove's confession, but the system he had served for decades was already crumbling faster than he could run. And run he did, because while truth had stood its ground, Charles Hargrove chose to flee. 3 days after the trial, under the gray veil of a D.C. dawn, Hargrove vanished. No court appearance, no farewell, no press statement. His townhouse was found abandoned, lights still burning, a half-drunk glass of scotch left sweating on the marble countertop. His phone, wallet, even his judicial credentials were left behind as if he had ripped himself out of his own life, like a man escaping a fire. Only a few grainy security camera images surfaced. A hunched figure boarding a private jet at a small airfield outside Baltimore, face shielded by a ball cap, coat collar turned high against the cold. Destination, Switzerland. No extradition treaty, no easy retrieval. He thought he had found a hiding place. But he was wrong. The story broke within hours, first on local news, then on the national wires, and then, unstoppable, onto the world stage. CNN blasted the headline across the bottom of every screen in America. Disgraced federal judge flees U.S. after courtroom scandal. Reuters carried it across Europe. Sky News reported from London. Le Monde ran it in Paris. Within a day, a Swiss news channel captured blurry footage of Hargrove slipping into a luxury villa outside Geneva, face hidden behind mirrored sunglasses, looking like a ghost of the authority he once wielded. But there was no sympathy waiting for him there. Only cameras, only headlines, only shame. Social media gave him a new title almost immediately, The Coward Judge. Memes flooded TikTok and X. Hargrove photoshopped with a chicken's body wearing a judge's robe. A fake movie poster titled Flight from Justice. One post read, he couldn't silence a cross, so now he's running from the truth. Another, if you can't face the truth, you don't deserve the bench. It wasn't just mockery, it was fury. Across the world, people saw what had happened for what it was. A man who had used his power to crush faith and silence dissent, and when he was called to account, he ran. Meanwhile, back in D.C., Jasmine Crockett watched it all unfold from her office window, arms crossed, the city lights flickering against the glass. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't smiling. There was no joy in watching a man fall, only the solemn, steady weight of what it cost to drag truth into the light. Her team hovered nearby, phones buzzing constantly with interview requests, press demands, public rallies forming spontaneously outside the courthouse. Jake Torres stood against the wall, a tablet in hand, shaking his head at the trending hashtags. He thought Switzerland would save him, Jake muttered. Man doesn't realize. Truth flies faster than jets. Jasmine's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Later that night, she agreed to sit for a live interview on CNN, a one-on-one, prime time, watched by millions. The studio lights were blinding, the cameras robotic, but Jasmine, seated alone in the center of a deep blue backdrop, looked utterly composed. The anchor's first question came fast. Congresswoman Crockett, what's your response to Judge Hargrove fleeing the country to avoid further proceedings? Jasmine didn't hesitate. Her voice was quiet but ironclad. Let him run, she said, but even in exile, truth travels faster. The words landed with more force than any headline could capture. She leaned forward slightly, her tone sharpening. A man can leave a courtroom. He can leave a city. He can even cross oceans. But he can't outrun what he did. And he can't outrun the people he tried to silence. Because truth isn't a place. It's not a bench or a building. It's a fire. And the more you run from it, the faster it burns. The anchor blinked, visibly caught off guard by the ferocity behind her calm delivery. This was never just about me, Jasmine continued. It was about every person who was told they didn't belong. Every prayer whispered under breath. Every child told to hide who they are. Every man and woman who carried their faith into public life and got punished for it. She paused, letting the silence stretch. They tried to exile the truth the same way he's trying to exile himself. But the thing about truth is, it doesn't need a passport. It doesn't need permission. It follows you. It exposes you. And eventually it demands justice. Across the country, people sat riveted. Bars, airports, family living rooms, hospital waiting rooms, watching not just a scandal, but a moment that felt bigger than any one trial. It felt like a shift. After the interview, Jasmine exited through the back of the CNN building, avoiding the crowd of reporters piling outside. The air was sharp and cold. She drew in a deep breath, the kind that felt like both a burden and a release. Jake caught up to her near the sidewalk, breathless. 3 million views in 30 minutes, he said. Every international outlet's quoting you. Switzerland's trending now, and not because of skiing. Jasmine smiled faintly, for real this time. Not in triumph, not in revenge. But because she understood, Hargrove had thought borders could save him. He had thought running could erase the shame. But what he didn't understand was that truth doesn't respect borders, and it never stops moving. Neither would she. Hargrove might have crossed an ocean to escape, but Jasmine Crockett understood something he never would. The truth had no borders, and justice had no expiration date. As the pressure built, it wasn't a question of if he would fall, it was only when. It happened faster than anyone predicted. One cold morning in Geneva, Swiss federal police, acting under an emergency international cooperation order and a flood of public outrage, surrounded the luxury villa where Hargrove had been hiding. They moved in silence. No sirens, no warnings. Just a tight tactical team moving with brutal efficiency. Inside, Hargrove sat at the edge of a leather couch, phone in hand, scrolling through news reports that had already named him the coward judge across every major outlet. When the glass doors burst open, he barely had time to stand before he was cuffed, his hands trembling, a single suitcase half-packed at his feet. Photos surfaced within minutes. Hargrove, disheveled, hunched over, being marched down the villa's stone steps under heavy guard. His face, once so powerful behind the gavel, now twisted into a mask of desperation and disgrace. International headlines screamed the news. Fugitive U.S. judge captured in Switzerland, facing $800 million lawsuit. Jasmine was in a closed-door strategy session with Rachel Harper and Jake Torres when the news broke. Jake glanced at his phone and let out a low whistle. He's done, he said simply, turning the screen to show the image. Jasmine looked at it for a long moment. She didn't gloat. She didn't cheer. She just nodded once, sharply, because this wasn't about humiliation. It was about accountability finally catching up to a man who thought he was above it. Extradition proceedings were accelerated by sheer public pressure. Swiss authorities, unwilling to be seen harboring a disgraced American official, handed Hargrove over without a fight. Within 72 hours, he was back on U.S. soil, under federal custody, his travel documents revoked, his assets frozen pending litigation. He wore an orange jumpsuit now, not a black robe, and he wasn't giving orders anymore. He was following them. The courtroom was packed for the damages hearing, standing room only. Jasmine entered, flanked by her team, a sea of supporters behind her, the silver cross at her neck gleaming under the courthouse lights like a banner carried into battle. Across the aisle, Hargrove sat hunched between two defense attorneys, gaunt, hollow-eyed, a man stripped not just of title, but of dignity. The judge, this time an impartial one, presided over the case with a firm hand. No theatrics, no loopholes. The facts spoke for themselves. Emails, recordings, handwritten notes, a black file documenting systemic bias over years, a public confession under oath. It was a clean, devastating case. The ruling came swift and brutal. Charles Hargrove was ordered to pay $800 million in damages to Jasmine Crockett. The courtroom exhaled in shock and awe. Reporters dashed from the building to feed the headlines. Protesters outside erupted in cheers, their signs waving like a forest in the cold wind. Inside, Jasmine sat still for a moment, absorbing the weight of the judgment. Not because she craved the money, not because she wanted revenge, but because for once, just once, the system had called its own bluff and lost. Outside, cameras pressed close as Jasmine stepped into the sunlight. Flash bulbs exploded. Microphones surged forward. Someone shouted, "How do you feel winning $800 million?" Jasmine looked into the crowd, not just at the reporters, but beyond them, at the people watching from the courthouse steps, from bus stops, from behind screens thousands of miles away. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Today isn't about money," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It's about every voice that was silenced, every prayer that was punished, every person told they didn't belong because of what they believed. Today, the law remembered who it's supposed to protect, and we're just getting started." The crowd roared, but Jasmine was already turning back toward the real work. Because while Hargrove's downfall was complete, the system he had operated in, the one that had allowed him to act for so long, was still very much alive. And Jasmine had no intention of leaving the job half done. Within weeks of the ruling, pressure on the D.C. judiciary exploded into action. The Judicial Reform Act, an emergency measure pushed through Congress by bipartisan demand, mandated sweeping changes across all federal courts, starting with the D.C. District Court. The first reform hit like a hammer. Effective immediately, no court within the district could fine, punish, or otherwise penalize individuals for wearing religious symbols, unless the symbol caused a direct, verifiable disruption to proceedings. No more arbitrary fines for crosses, no more warnings for prayer scarves, no more silent erasure of belief. And that was just the beginning. The second mandate cut even deeper. Every sitting judge, magistrate, and court officer in the D.C. system would be required to complete mandatory retraining in constitutional law, with special focus on First Amendment protections. No exceptions, no grandfather clauses, no hiding behind years of tenure or prestige. Jasmine watched it all unfold from her office overlooking Pennsylvania Avenue, arms folded, a small, satisfied smile curving at the corner of her mouth. Rachel Harper pored over the official reform notices at the conference table, her face uncharacteristically bright. Jake Torres was already brainstorming media campaigns to spread awareness about the new protections nationwide. It wasn't just a victory, it was a pivot point, a line drawn in history. Late that night, Jasmine sat alone in her office. The city lights glittered against the windows. She turned her chair slightly to face the small wooden stand on the side table, where her mother's Bible and the silver cross now rested side by side under a warm lamp. She thought about everything it had taken to reach this moment, every insult, every fine, every courtroom where she had been stared at like she didn't belong, every door slammed in her face. She touched the cross lightly, feeling its weight. No longer a burden, but a badge, a memory, a promise. And when she looked back out over Washington, D.C., she didn't see a battlefield anymore. She saw a beginning. Because some wars aren't fought with weapons. They're fought with standing, with speaking, with refusing to kneel when the whole world demands it. And Jasmine Crockett had stood. And because she stood, millions more would too. The changes inside Washington had started with a court case, a courtroom, and one silver cross. But outside the marble walls of D.C., something much bigger was already rumbling to life. Something Jasmine Crockett herself had never dared to hope for. A movement she hadn't just ignited, but unleashed. It began in Texas. Barely a month after Hargrove's fall, a bipartisan coalition in the Texas legislature, Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike, introduced a bill titled the Faith Protection and Public Expression Act. Its purpose was simple, but revolutionary. No individual could be penalized, fined, or otherwise disciplined in any public institution for the quiet, personal expression of religious belief. Wearing a cross, carrying prayer beads, bowing a head in silent prayer. The right was absolute, so long as it did not cause material disruption. The bill sailed through committee hearings faster than anyone predicted, buoyed by citizen petitions and viral footage of Jasmine's trial testimony that had never stopped circulating online. In an unprecedented move, the bill passed unanimously, both chambers, within a week. When the Texas governor signed it into law, standing before a wall of American flags, he said simply, "We learned from Jasmine Crockett that freedom of faith isn't negotiable. Not here, not anywhere." And Texas wasn't alone. In Florida, similar legislation followed days later, pushed by a coalition of civil rights groups, veterans associations, and immigrant communities who had seen firsthand how religious identity was too often treated as a threat rather than a right. On the Senate floor, one representative held up a photo of Jasmine during debate, her cross gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the courtroom, her posture unbroken, and declared, "If standing for faith is now an act of rebellion, then we need rebels." The Florida bill passed by a wide margin, and the governor signed it into law at a ceremony attended by faith leaders from every tradition: Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, Buddhist, standing shoulder to shoulder in a moment that transcended party and creed. Then came Ohio. In the heartland, far from the marble towers of D.C., churches, community centers, and universities had already begun organizing. Rallies spilled out into town squares. Letters poured into state offices. Students wore crosses, stars, scarves, and bracelets to class, daring administrators to challenge them. The pressure was unstoppable. Within 6 weeks, Ohio passed the Religious Freedom in Public Life Act, a sweeping set of protections that codified the right to personal faith expression in every courthouse, every school, every public square. And when the governor signed it, the cameras captured a moment no one could have scripted: an elderly Holocaust survivor placing a trembling hand on the governor's arm and saying through tears, "Thank you for remembering." And at the center of it all was Jasmine. She never asked to lead a movement. She hadn't planned to, but sometimes the fight chooses you, and when it does, you either stand or you kneel. And Jasmine Crockett had stood. The calls began almost immediately, first from legal organizations, then from civil rights groups, then from faith coalitions across the political spectrum, and finally from the White House itself. Jasmine stood in her office, staring at the official letter embossed with the presidential seal, reading the words twice before she dared believe them. "On behalf of the administration, we would be honored if you would serve as the National Advisor on Religious Freedom." Her hand shook slightly as she lowered the letter, not from fear, from the gravity of it. Rachel Harper looked up from her laptop, seeing her face. "You deserve it," Rachel said simply. Jake Torres, sitting at the conference table surrounded by media briefs, grinned. "You're about to make history all over again." Jasmine exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her bones. She had gone to court to defend one small symbol around her neck. Now she was being asked to defend the right of millions to wear theirs. Accepting wasn't a question. It was destiny. The announcement hit the newswires before sunset. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, all flashing her name across the bottom of the screen. The woman who once stood alone at the plaintiff's table, fined for wearing a cross, was now being entrusted to guide the nation's policy on the very freedoms she had refused to surrender. In speeches from Austin to Tallahassee to Columbus, leaders invoked her story. Students wrote essays about her in civics classes. Law professors rewrote curriculum to include her case alongside landmark First Amendment battles. Social media exploded in celebration. Crockett doctrine, Shacham, faith is freedom. Sharsha stand with Jasmine memes showed Jasmine standing like a lighthouse against a storm of gavel-wielding judges. Quotes from her trial testimony: "They tried to make my faith a weapon. They forgot. Truth doesn't kneel," were plastered across murals, posters, t-shirts, and through it all, Jasmine remained steady, because she knew the work wasn't done. Freedom didn't survive on victory speeches. It survived on vigilance, on reminding the country again and again that rights weren't gifts, they were promises. Promises written not just on paper, but in blood and sacrifice and memory. One cold evening, standing before a crowd of thousands in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, Jasmine delivered her first speech as National Advisor for Religious Freedom. The night air crackled with energy. Families, veterans, students, faith leaders, skeptics, believers, all standing together, shoulder to shoulder, packed into the National Mall like a living river. Jasmine stood at the podium, silver cross shining under the floodlights, and spoke without notes. They tried to silence faith by calling it chaos. They tried to punish belief by calling it disorder. But what they forgot, what they always forget, is that faith isn't chaos. Faith is courage, and courage doesn't bow. Not to fear, not to anger, not to the cold machinery of power. We don't kneel for injustice. We kneel for prayer. And today, America kneels for nothing but the truth. The roar that rose up from the crowd was deafening, rolling over the reflecting pool, crashing against the marble steps of the memorial, echoing across the city Jasmine had once stood alone in. But she wasn't alone anymore. Her fight had become their fight. Her stand had become a movement, and it was just beginning. The night Jasmine Crockett stood before the Lincoln Memorial, something ancient stirred beneath the surface of America. Not rage, not violence, but a different kind of force, a collective memory waking up. The roar of the crowd didn't die when she left the stage. It traveled. It burrowed into the streets of D.C., slipped into the veins of old highways, whispered through cornfields and steel towns and neon-lit city blocks. It moved faster than any news cycle could contain, leaping from heart to heart, unspoken but understood. Freedom wasn't given. It was fought for again and again by those willing to stand alone until they didn't have to anymore. In Texas, the first shock waves hit like thunder. Across Dallas and Houston, in churches tucked between glass skyscrapers and dusty highways, congregations rose to their feet during Sunday services, not to cheer politics, but to honor the simple, dangerous act of refusing to bow to injustice. In one high school outside Austin, students walked into class wearing small crosses, stars, prayer bracelets, stitched yarmulkes, not in protest but in quiet declaration. A teacher who once feared reprimanding students for religious attire now greeted them with a smile. Someone posted a photo of it online. Students standing shoulder to shoulder, a sea of different faiths, united not by religion, but by the right to believe. It went viral within hours. The caption was simple: Jasmine stood. Now we all do. Florida responded next, but in its own way. Louder, brasher, but no less sincere. In Miami, a rally of over 10,000 packed into Bayfront Park. Banners reading "Faith is Freedom" flapping in the ocean breeze. There were gospel choirs, yes, but also imams reciting prayers, Buddhist monks in saffron robes offering blessings, Sikh leaders tying turbans on volunteers of every race and background. It wasn't a political rally, it wasn't even a protest. It was a celebration, the kind of spontaneous unity that could only be born from shared scars. TV stations tried to cover it like a spectacle, but anyone who stood in that crowd knew the truth. This wasn't about Jasmine anymore. This was about reclaiming something that had been slipping away, piece by piece, while no one was looking. In Ohio, the echo took a different form. Colleges held forums titled Faith and Freedom, Beyond the Courtroom. Students once too timid to show religious identity now organized faith expression days, encouraged by new statewide protections. In a small town outside Dayton, an elderly woman named Mrs. Garcia, who had been fined 10 years earlier for whispering a prayer before testifying in court, stood up at a city council meeting. She wore the same cross she had once been ordered to hide, her voice strong as she declared, "I will never bow again to silence." Across the country, ordinary people began to reclaim small pieces of themselves they had been taught to hide. Veterans pinned medals and crosses side by side onto their jackets during parades. Flight attendants wore tiny charms tucked proudly against their uniforms. Judges in courthouses paused and reconsidered old decorum rules, conscious now of what those rules had quietly cost for decades. It wasn't rebellion, it was recovery. It was memory fighting its way back into the bloodstream of a nation that had nearly forgotten what it meant to truly be free. The media couldn't contain it. No spin could sanitize it. No political party could fully claim it. They tried at first. Some outlets reduced it to sound bites. Crockett controversy sparks debate. Others, desperate to fit it into old narratives, labeled it Jasmine's revolution. But none of the labels stuck because it didn't belong to Jasmine alone anymore. It belonged to every kid who had hidden their faith under a hoodie, every grandparent who had tucked a prayer card into their coat pocket, every immigrant who crossed a border not for wealth, but for the right to worship freely. And Jasmine knew it. She saw it in the letters piling up in her office. Handwritten notes from children in Nebraska, emails from teachers in Michigan, video messages from soldiers stationed overseas. One letter from a teenage girl in Wyoming stood out. "I used to be afraid to wear my grandmother's cross to school. Now, because of you, I wear it every day. Thank you for fighting for all of us." Jasmine kept that letter in the top drawer of her desk, beside the courtroom transcript where she first stood alone. Two symbols side by side. Two battles fought across the same invisible line between silence and standing. In Washington, the political establishment scrambled to catch up. Hearings were scheduled to examine courtroom practices nationwide. States rushed to pass mirror laws protecting religious expression in public institutions. Faith groups, once wary of one another, began forming unlikely coalitions, recognizing that the threat to one was, and always had been, a threat to all. At the National Conference of Governors, Jasmine was invited as the keynote speaker, a slot usually reserved for seasoned politicians, not civil rights pioneers. When she stood at the podium, the room full of governors, mayors, and national press corps rose to their feet before she even spoke a word. Her speech wasn't grandiose. It wasn't laced with political rhetoric. It was simple, honest, cutting. Freedom of faith is not a gift from the government. It is a right born with every human soul. And every time we forget that, we lose a piece of ourselves. She didn't speak long. She didn't have to. When she stepped down from the stage, leaders rushed to shake her hand, to pledge support, to ask for guidance on crafting new protections. Some promised legislative action within weeks. Others invited her to collaborate directly on drafting reforms. The movement had become too large, too real, too urgent to ignore. And Jasmine? She didn't see herself as a hero. She saw herself as a bridge between what the country had promised itself and what it still had to become. One night, standing by her office window, watching the lights of D.C. twinkle like a river of stars, Jake Torres walked in with a tablet full of news clippings. "Texas passed another expansion on the Faith Act," he said, breathless. "Florida's extending protections to college campuses now. Ohio's introducing a scholarship fund for students defending religious liberty." He grinned, half in awe. "You didn't just start a movement," Jake said. "You started a map." Jasmine turned back to the window, thinking about all the unseen people across the country. Those she would never meet, whose lives were a little freer because she had refused to sit down when a judge demanded it. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply stood a little taller, because this wasn't just her story anymore. It was America's. The city lay quiet beneath the heavy velvet of a D.C. night, but Jasmine Crockett couldn't sleep. She stood alone by the wide windows of her office, one hand resting lightly against the cool glass, staring out over the city that had once threatened to crush her and now carried her voice like a standard into battlefields she would never even see. Behind her, the room was dark, save for the faint glow of the lamp resting atop her desk. Beside it, under glass, sat the silver cross, the one that started everything, the one a judge had tried to shame, the one the world now recognized as a symbol of quiet, unyielding revolution. She let her fingers trail across the glass, remembering, not the court victory, not the applause, but the smaller moments, the ones no one else saw. The moment she stood alone in that courtroom, fined like a criminal for her silent faith. The moment she decided to fight, knowing it would mean being dragged through the mud, attacked, misunderstood. The moment she realized it wasn't about her at all, but about every nameless soul who carried their belief quietly through hostile spaces, just trying to exist. Jasmine closed her eyes. The images came in flashes. The trembling voice of the woman in Ohio thanking her for fighting. The shy smiles of students in Texas wearing crosses and stars of David to class without fear. The veterans who saluted her, not because she wore a uniform, but because she had defended the Constitution they had bled to protect. She thought about her mother too, about the days spent working double shifts just to keep the lights on, about the nights when Jasmine would fall asleep to the sound of whispered prayers, the smell of fried chicken, and the quiet, bone-deep weariness of a woman carrying the weight of survival. Her mother's cross wasn't expensive. It wasn't polished. It didn't glitter like jewelry. It was worn, scratched, real, like the people it had been handed down through, generation after generation, each one clinging to faith when all else seemed lost. And that night, Jasmine finally understood something she had always known, but had never put into words. It had never been about winning. It had always been about refusing to disappear, about standing tall even when the world demanded she kneel, about holding on to truth even when it cost everything, about choosing faith over fear, dignity over silence, humanity over comfort. The cross had been a promise to herself long before it became a banner to the world, a promise not to be erased, a promise not to let the machinery of power grind her into dust, a promise to be what her ancestors had dreamed she would be when they prayed under stars, behind barred windows, across oceans of hardship and hope. Jasmine opened her eyes and breathed in the night air. She didn't need monuments built in her honor. She didn't need movies or statues or endless retellings. The real monument was already alive, beating in the hearts of 1,000 strangers who had heard her story and decided to stand taller because of it. And that was enough. No, not enough. It was everything. Behind her, the lamp flickered softly. On the desk beside the cross sat the newest legislation drafts, the faith protection amendments being introduced in 5 more states. Each bill bore the fingerprints of the battle she had waged, not as relics of her own story, but as blueprints for the future. And Jasmine Crockett, once just another name in a case file, now stood as the reason millions more would never be forced to hide who they were. She ran a finger over the edge of the cross through the glass, smiling faintly. Not the smile of someone who had finished a race, but of someone who had realized the race never really ends. It is picked up by new hands, new hearts, again and again, passed like a flame through the generations. Because faith, real faith, isn't something you hold alone. It's something you light in others. The clock struck midnight, the sound soft and resonant against the silence. Outside, the city slept, unaware that another lawmaker was drafting new protections, that another pastor was counseling a teenager to be proud of her identity, that another teacher was telling a shy boy he could wear his cross without shame. The ripple was still moving, still growing, and Jasmine knew it would outlive her. She walked back to her desk, picked up her journal, and in neat, careful handwriting wrote a single line across the empty page. They tried to make my faith my weakness. They only proved it was my greatest strength. She closed the journal, turned out the lamp, and stepped quietly into the dark, carrying the fire forward, exactly as it was meant to be. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.